Have you ever heard of a kingdom that vanished because their calendar was wrong? Just one mistake, and seasons, ships, and history quietly unraveled. You can settle in now, wherever you are, lying down, sitting back, maybe with the fan on low, or a blanket around your shoulders. Just let your hands relax. Let your jaw soften. Let your eyes grow heavy if they're not already. Because tonight's story won't rush anywhere. It's a story of stillness, and patience, and silence. A very long silence, stretching across centuries, carefully observed, quietly recorded, and never once explained. We begin with a tower. It wasn't a famous tower, not tall enough to be a landmark, not old enough to be ancient, not pretty enough to be painted, but it was there. Built from gray stone, its edges dulled by moss and sea wind. It stood just beyond a road no one took unless they had to. The locals called it the Audiencia Muta, the Tower of Mute Listening. And for more than 400 years, someone always sat inside it, doing nothing, not praying, not speaking, not waiting for orders or bells or signs from above. They were listening, not for birds, not for storms, not even for danger. They were listening for silence. And every hour they wrote down whether it had remained. The first records are dated in the year 1427. In a small slope town called Lurano, not far from the salt trails where fog hangs low and sheep sometimes wander into courtyards. It was not a place of stories, not a place where history usually stops to take a breath. But it had the tower, and the tower had a boy. His name was Eldrick, and by 12 years old he already knew how to hear more than most people said. He didn't learn it from school or books or teachers. He learned it from stillness. His family had tended the tower for generations, not as owners, but as keepers of the record. That record? It was the daily state of the silence. Each shift had its own log, and each log tracked the inner and outer quiet. The sounds that didn't happen, the thoughts that stayed still, the moments that passed without interruption. A single entry might look something like this. Hour 2. Wind soft against eastern wall. No audible disturbance. Breathing steady. Mind returned to neutral after brief wandering. These lines weren't poetry. They weren't coded. They were training. For the mind, for the town, maybe even for the soul. Because this wasn't about hearing everything. It was about hearing nothing, and noticing when that nothing changed. The tower had no bells, no clocks, no guards or symbols or crests. But still, like someone sat there every single day. Some believed it was a kind of ancient ritual, a holdover from older beliefs, when silence was considered a divine offering. Others thought it was a test, a long, slow experiment, to see how people behaved when trained to monitor stillness instead of chaos. But no one questioned it out loud, because the tower was quiet. And in that part of the world, quiet things were not disturbed. Eldrick's job began at dawn. 3 hours before sunrise, he'd climb the winding inner stairs, his hands never touching the walls, his shoes softened with old wool, careful not to wake the birds nesting just outside the 3rd floor slit. Once inside the main chamber, he'd sit cross-legged on the smooth stone mat, his tools, 1 page, 1 inkpot, 1 quill so fine it didn't scratch, and 1 hourglass turned at the start of each listening block. That's it. He wasn't allowed to write poetry. He wasn't allowed to sketch or hum or imagine stories. He was only to listen and to observe the silence. Now, silence is not always the same. There's the silence of a snowy morning, the silence of someone just about to speak, the silence when you're the only one awake, and the silence when no one will ever wake again. Eldrick was trained to tell the difference. More importantly, he was trained to record what kind of silence each hour held. He learned to distinguish between external silence, no sound from the outside world, and internal silence, a mind free of racing thoughts. Both mattered, and both could be broken. Sometimes the world was silent, but his own thoughts interrupted. Sometimes his mind was still, but a distant creak or gust broke the outer peace. Either one had to be noted. One afternoon during his 7th week of training, he wrote, "Hour 6, bird call at window did not enter mind. Silence maintained, breath even. No internal movement. Good hour." On another, "Hour 10, brief internal excitement. Remembered a friend's voice. Calmed within one breath. External world remained still." This wasn't meditation. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't punishment. It was simply the task. Silence was the subject, and the only goal was to understand it. By the time Eldrick was 17, he no longer needed to focus. The silence came to him. He could walk into the tower, close his eyes, and immediately feel the tone of the hour. Some mornings were shallow, light, fragile silence that could vanish with a single echo. Others were deep, like standing at the bottom of a well, where even your breath felt loud. He never questioned it, never wondered why it mattered. But then, one winter morning, without warning, a thought came to him, not like a shout, not like a memory, just a question, not spoken, not even fully formed, just a soft nudge in his mind. Why? He didn't answer, but he did record it. Hour 1, silence disturbed by internal inquiry. Why? No voice, no image. Will monitor recurrence. Silence, internal inquiry, monitor recurrence. He didn't hear it again the next hour, but the silence felt different. It wasn't broken exactly, but it wasn't whole either. It was like a soft crease had formed in a page that used to be smooth, a barely there wrinkle, just enough to remind him the page had been touched. That afternoon, when he finished his final entry, he didn't write a conclusion. He just dipped the quill, watched the ink bead, and let the page stay blank beneath the final line. He never did that before. And when he walked home, the road seemed louder. Not because of noise, but because he noticed every pebble underfoot, the breeze brushing his cheek. The moment a crow flew overhead but didn't caw, the world hadn't changed, he had. And silence, it was no longer just something to listen to. It was something to question. The next day, he returned before the first hour, not out of duty, out of curiosity. Would it happen again? That quiet little question? Would the silence let him go deeper, or would it hold him at the surface? Hour 1 passed. Then, hour 2. Nothing. Just steady quiet. Measured breathing. No disruption from within or without. By hour 3, he felt a calm he hadn't felt in months. Like the question had been a passing breeze, and now the stillness had settled again. But when he reached for the ink, his hand paused. His fingers trembled. Not from cold, but from uncertainty, because he didn't want to write another log. He wanted to write about the silence. Not record it, not document it, describe it, explore it, understand it. He wanted to ask it things, but he didn't. He wrote the log, the usual way, the expected way. Hour 3, full internal and external silence. No breaches, mind clear, sound absent, silence stable. But as soon as the ink dried, he whispered something. The first sound he'd made in that room in over 3 years. Just one word. Why? The stone walls didn't echo it. They seemed to absorb it. Like the tower had been waiting for that word to be said aloud. And now it was done. The silence didn't end. But it wasn't pure anymore. It was listening back. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about the records, all those pages, all those hours. Generations of his family, hundreds of years of documentation, but no one ever asked the tower why it needed to be silent, or who they were writing the logs for. The next week, Eldrick began arriving early. He stopped turning the hourglass. He stopped writing with the formal phrasing. He still listened, still sat quietly. But his silence changed shape. It wasn't compliance anymore. It was investigation. And slowly, the tower responded. He started hearing things he'd never noticed. The faint crack of cold stone adjusting in the early light. The flutter of a single moth wing near the top slit of glass. The dry rasp of his sleeve brushing against wool when he breathed too deeply. They weren't interruptions. They were signals, tiny conversations the tower had always been having, that he'd never learned to hear. And deeper still, there was something beneath even that. A rhythm, not like music, not like a heartbeat. More like a pattern, like silence itself was following rules. Rules that no one had ever written down. Rules that governed what kind of silence came before rain. What kind came when someone nearby was crying quietly in another room. And what kind came when nothing at all was happening, not even thought. He began classifying them. Type A, thin silence morning, wind present, body calm. Type B, weighted silence after emotion, slight hum in chest. Type C, blank silence, dreamless, like a page that never held ink. His journals filled with these, not the official logs. These were separate. Pages folded into his sleeves, bound under his tunic, written by moonlight when no one was watching. No one else ever asked to see them, but he couldn't stop writing them. Because for the first time, the tower felt alive, and the silence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, something that had always been there, waiting for someone to realize it was speaking too, just in its own language. He didn't speak again for many days, not aloud at least, but the thoughts had shifted. He no longer arrived at the tower with a blank mind. He arrived with intention, a question tucked beneath his ribs, quiet but pulsing. Not, why is the silence here? But what is it trying to tell me? The difference was small, but enough to change everything. During the gray watch, those early hours before sunrise, the silence felt layered now. Like standing in fog and slowly realizing there are shapes inside it, hints, outlines, waiting for you to see them. He stopped using the formal ink after the 4th week. The official logs still had to be written, of course. But those were for the elders, for the drawer, for the vault no one opened. His real pages now lived beneath a loose stone beside the northern wall, folded and pressed between dry cloth, hidden from moisture, hidden from memory. He began assigning names to certain silences. There was the shouldered quiet, heavy and pressing like someone else's sadness had drifted into the room. There was the threaded stillness, thin and taut, as if something far away was waiting. And then the woven calm, full, warm, humming lightly behind the ears like a voice about to sing but never does. No one taught him this. It came from listening, not for minutes, not for hours, but for years. And now, he could feel the difference between a silence that waited and a silence that had already passed through. One morning something changed, not in sound, in presence. He arrived, as always, before the first gray hint of light touched the distant sea. But when he opened the tower door, the air felt cooler. Not cold from wind, but cold from absence. The tower felt emptier, and not in the way it always had. Not peaceful, not still, vacant. He lit his small oil lamp and walked slowly up the steps. Dust rose as his foot brushed the edges of the stair. It had never done that before. The dust had always been undisturbed, but now it danced. The chamber felt untouched, but not untouched by time. Untouched by him. As if for a few hours the tower had not been watched. And something had moved through in that time. He stood in the center and waited. Didn't sit. Didn't breathe too deeply. He just listened. It rained for 5 days after that, not the kind of storm that lashes, not the kind that makes the ocean wail, but the quiet kind, slow, steady, soft as if the sky itself were grieving without sound. The tower did not like the rain, not because of the wet. The stone was sealed well. The roof, though ancient, held firm, but because the silence changed. It didn't arrive all at once anymore. It bled in slowly, drowned beneath the rhythm of droplets tapping the high windows. It wasn't a clean quiet, it was full of tiny disturbances. The watcher felt as though he were trying to listen through another listener. The tower was not alone. Something else was listening too. On the third day, he dreamt of the first watcher. He didn't know her name, no records listed it. Just the title, the one who opened the tower. But in his dream, she stood barefoot in the round room, arms folded, head tilted, eyes closed. And when he asked, without speaking, what she was waiting for, she whispered, "I'm not waiting, I'm remembering." He woke with tears on his cheeks. Not sadness, not fear, just recognition. There were memories inside the tower, not his, not anyone's, but of moments kept alive through the architecture of listening. That day he brought no paper, no ink, just a bowl of dry rice, a strand of red thread, and a mirror, the kind used for reading light from the upper coast. He placed the mirror flat on the floor in the center of the chamber, facing the ceiling. He tied the thread to a pebble and lowered it until it hovered just above the glass. Then he waited, not for answers, but for arrangement. The tower didn't speak, but the thread shifted, not from breeze, there was none, but from something deeper. By nightfall, the thread had formed a spiral, not random, not perfect, but intentional. He made no record of it, not yet. That night, he sat beside the western wall, hand pressed to the stone, and he began to hum, softly, just above the throat, a single note, low and even. He had never sung before. It wasn't permitted. The tower was meant to be heard, not filled. But this wasn't a song. It was a question in a shape. And the silence. It answered, not with a sound, but with pressure. The way the air feels before a storm. That stillness that wraps itself around your bones. That pause that isn't empty, just holding something you can't name. He stayed that way for hours, humming, listening, letting the quiet press gently back. By dawn, the mirror had fogged, not from breath, not from heat, but from condensation that formed a word in the center. He wiped it gently, afraid to look. But when he did, it wasn't a word at all, just a symbol, a shape he didn't recognize, but felt like he had seen in the dream. He copied it later in the margin of his old logbook. Just a tiny thing. No explanation, just recorded, in case it needed to be remembered again. The elders never asked about the tower's moods. They wanted pages, quiet compliance, an unbroken string of dull records that proved silence still lived there. But he began to wonder, what if the tower didn't need to be watched? What if it was watching, and had been, all along? He returned to the tower the next morning just after the clouds broke. The sun filtered down in gold threads between the trees, touching the stones like fingers brushing old parchment. Everything looked the same. The cracked threshold, the door that never creaked, the faint moss that had started to grow in the eastern seam of the arch. But it felt different. The moment he stepped through the doorway, the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just denser. Like the air had remembered something he hadn't. And on the floor just inside the threshold lay the red thread. It hadn't been there when he left. He was certain. He had tied it in the round chamber. But here it was, coiled perfectly in a shape like an eye, unblinking. He did not touch it, not out of fear, but respect. Instead, he stepped around it and moved up the spiraling stairs. They were smoother now, weren't they? Hadn't the stone been chipped in places before? He couldn't be sure. The tower didn't like certainty. It made things static, still, predictable, and this silence was alive. In the round chamber, the mirror was still there, dry now, clear as ice, but the symbol was gone. In its place was a single hair, white, curved. He reached for it without thinking, and the moment he touched it, he remembered something that was never his. A long corridor, lit by lanterns filled with snow-colored oil, the scent of beeswax and burnt rosemary, and a voice, not speaking but breathing just beside his left shoulder. He stumbled back. The mirror clattered gently. The moment broke. He was in the tower again, alone, but not untouched. He sat cross-legged in the center and closed his eyes. He didn't write. He didn't observe. He simply listened. He stayed that way for what felt like hours, until his breath matched the pulse of the silence itself, and in that pause, he heard it. Not a sound, but a shape in sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't music. It was something like the breath before a name, a holding of potential, an invitation, and then it was gone. The tower did not record sound with tools. It recorded with presence. It asked nothing, but offered memory in return. He stood gently and looked at the western wall. There, faint but visible, was an inscription. Old, older than the plaster, not ink, etched. And it read not in a language he recognized, but in symbols, the same spiral, the same eye, the same pattern the red thread had formed on the floor. It had always been there. He just hadn't seen it. Not because he was blind, but because he hadn't listened deeply enough. He began to retrace the room now, fingertip by fingertip, feeling the grooves, mapping the ancient markings like a child learning a lullaby. There were dozens of them, hundreds. All too faint to see unless the light hit just right, and in that moment he understood. The tower wasn't silent. It was singing, just slowly, over centuries. Each watcher didn't come to guard quiet. They came to add to the song. He wept, not from sorrow, but relief. He wasn't alone. Not truly. He had never been. The watchers before him weren't gone. They were part of the structure, part of the breath, part of the pause. And he was a note now, too. By the time evening returned, the clouds had lowered their veil once more. Rain didn't fall, but the air dripped. Trees exhaled mist, and the tower stood breathing, unseen by most, yet impossibly present. He didn't leave this time. He brought a blanket from the house down the hill, a flask of warm broth, and a small, leather-bound journal. He didn't plan to write in it. He just wanted it near. A comfort, like a memory you hold without needing to speak it aloud. Inside the tower, the red thread remained in its eye shape, still, but never lifeless. He stepped over it slowly, nodding as though greeting an old friend. Climbing the spiral steps again, he no longer hesitated. His fingers traced the walls, each smooth curve of stone, each dip worn by centuries of boots and barefoot watchers. The wind had begun to sing again, but not from outside. This song curled inside the walls. Not music, truly, but the vibration of memory long held, the echo of quiet lives. And tonight the silence was warmer. The round chamber waited. It did not demand. It only received. And in that receiving, it reflected. He sat in the center once more. No mirror now. No hair. No symbol. Just space and stone and breath. And slowly, he began to hum. No melody. No purpose. Just sound. Like a bird unsure if it's still night or morning. The hum joined the silence, folded into it, was not lost but kept, and he understood. This was how it worked. You did not fill the silence. You trusted it to hold what you offered, and in return it gave you echoes, not of yourself, but of the others who had come before. He heard her then, the woman with the inked wrists, the one whose breath lingered on the stairs. She had hummed too. Years ago. A different note, but the same longing, and her hum had met his. Two notes in the same cave of time, neither past nor present, just sound, held, and replayed by stone and stillness. He opened the journal then, without meaning to write, but the moment he did, a gust of warm air pushed softly against his back, as if someone was behind him, encouraging. And the pen, which had lain dry since spring, began to move. He did not write words. He wrote spirals and eyes and thread lines, shapes that had meaning he did not yet know, but trusted. He kept writing, not feverishly, but with calm hands, as if the silence guided his grip. Page after page, the ink flowed. The lines began to change. They wove into structures, rooms, walls, windows, a map. He blinked. It was a map of the tower, but more. Hidden levels, subchambers, a well, a gate beneath the spiral stair. He felt a pulse behind his left ear. Not pain, just a memory pushing forward. He dropped the pen. The ink had stopped anyway. The flask of broth had gone cold beside him, untouched, and he stood, journal in hand, still humming, still part of the pause. He walked back to the entrance of the chamber, looked down the stairwell. The rain had started, soft, patient, like a lullaby pressing its lips to stone, and he smiled, because the tower was not watching. It was remembering. And he was now part of its memory. The rain whispered through the narrow arrow slits of the tower. It didn't pour. It didn't batter. It simply arrived, like an old friend standing at the edge of a conversation, present but not interrupting. He descended the spiral stairs with the journal cradled in both hands, as though it were still warm. Each step echoed softer than the last, as if the tower had started cushioning sound again, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. The red thread on the floor had moved, only slightly, but enough. It no longer formed an eye. Now it looped itself gently into the shape of an open gate. Not a symbol he'd seen before, not in books, not in dreams. He stood above it, not stepping forward just yet. His breath fogged faintly in the cool air, but only his. The tower had no breath, it had memory, and in that memory, breath had already been recorded. He kneeled beside the red thread, touched it lightly. It was cool and dry, but flexible, like silk left out in the night. He followed its shape again with his eyes, looping, inviting, unfinished. A gate that opened only inward, and beneath it, barely visible against the worn stone floor, a seam, almost a perfect circle. A hatch, no handle, no hinges. But he could feel the change in the air above it, the same as when you stand near deep water, or a cavern, or an old secret. He set the journal aside, rested both palms on the stone. It didn't open, but he stayed, fingers splayed, eyes closed. And slowly, almost shyly, a sound rose beneath the floor. Tick, 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 not mechanical, not alive, like soft nails on wood, or a long-forgotten fingernail brushing pages in the dark. It stopped, but it had happened. He whispered, "I heard you." Not to provoke, not to challenge, just to let the silence know he was still listening, and in return, nothing moved, nothing changed. But he knew something had registered. Upstairs, the round room called again, not loudly, not even audibly, but a pressure lifted behind his ribs. He stood and returned, this time with bare feet. As soon as his soles touched the stone floor of the upper chamber, he could feel a warmth radiating upward. Subtle, not heat, but presence. The journal lay open, but the pages were blank. He hadn't left them blank. He had filled them earlier with spirals and maps and shapes, but now they had emptied, not erased, taken, stored, recorded by the tower. He didn't panic. He didn't feel loss. It was like a child letting go of a message in a bottle, knowing it now floated where it needed to go. He sat again, cross-legged, hands open in his lap, and the silence arrived beside him. Not as a feeling, but as a memory. A whisper inside the chest. A small voice saying, "I've been here before." But he hadn't. Had he? Another image came then. Not a dream, not a hallucination. A woman walking down the same stairs, not the inked-wristed one. Someone else. Older, barefoot, carrying a lantern made of woven reeds, her face soft, weathered. She hummed too, and in her other hand, a child's shoe. She placed it on the center of the floor, knelt, closed her eyes, and the silence took it, gently, without greed. And when she stood, the shoe remained. But she had forgotten why she brought it. He saw it now. Right in front of him, the same shoe. It hadn't aged, it hadn't rotted, just rested. He reached for it, but his fingers stopped inches away. It wasn't meant for him. It was meant to be seen, not claimed. So he bowed his head. When he woke, the tower was already listening. Not waiting, not demanding, just present. There was no sense of time lost, no stiffness in his limbs, no hunger in his gut, just awareness, gentle, calm, whole. The journal still lay open beside him, but now one page had changed. A single line had returned, written in the same ink as before, but in handwriting that was not his. The silence remembers what we forget. He ran a finger lightly under the line. It didn't smear. It had dried long ago, or perhaps never wet at all. He smiled faintly. It was not a riddle. It was an invitation to trust, to remain, to continue. He looked toward the spiral ceiling, and in the morning light, if it was morning, he noticed the soft dust above him had gathered into shapes again. Not symbols, faces. Faint, impressionistic, barely there impressions, like someone had brushed their cheek into ash and pressed it upward. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 7, all staring slightly downward, but never directly at him, eyes unfocused, lips closed, witnesses, or echoes. He stood slowly, stretching his fingers wide, grounding his balance on the smooth stone. No dizziness, no fear. He walked again to the narrow arch, the curve of the stairwell where stone met shadow. And again, the red thread had changed. It had moved again. Not as before, not into a symbol, but now it traced a path, a single line, meandering down the stairs. Subtle, quiet, like a trail of thought. He followed it, step by step. It led him down past the familiar floor, past the chamber where the wooden hatch had hidden the tapping sound. The thread continued, downward, further than he had known the tower even descended. And now as he followed it, the walls changed. No longer smooth-cut stone, but rough ancient earth, pressed with fingers, not tools, cavernous, alive. The thread stopped, not at a door, not at a threshold, but in front of a wall, a flat earthen surface with no seams, yet it vibrated with a strange softness, like breath through cloth. He reached out to touch it. The moment his fingertips met the dirt, it breathed inward, like someone sucking in air behind it, and a soft shape appeared, a handprint, small, childlike. And beneath it, etched into the dirt, a name, Ciel. He whispered it out loud. CL. It hung in the air like a bell tone with no echo. The wall began to part, not like stone splitting, but like fabric peeling open after a long winter. Behind it, not a chamber, not a room, but a vast black stillness, not empty, but untouched. It wasn't darkness, it was waiting. And the silence for the first time felt different. No longer a listener. Now, a companion. He stepped forward, inside. Not cold, not warm. Just a neutral hum, like the earth thinking. His footsteps made no sound, not even in his mind. The journal still in hand, he opened to the page with the single line. The silence remembers what we forget. Below it, another sentence had appeared, in his own handwriting this time. Some memories must remain buried. He paused, not out of fear, but because he now understood. This place wasn't made to hold knowledge. It was made to cradle forgetting. The silence recorded things not to be remembered, but to keep them safe, from being remembered. He closed the journal and sat. In the vast hollow space that remembered everything that hurt too much to hold. He sat for a long time. No time. And slowly, in that soft, breathless place, he let go of the spiral, of the tapping, of the woman with inked wrists, of the shoe, of the tower, of himself, until he too was only silence. And the tower above, still and listening, held him like it had held so many before, and would hold again. Years passed, or perhaps moments. It was difficult to know. The silence in the hollow below the tower was not like the silence above. There was no weight to it, no shape, only presence. A stillness so complete that even thought learned to hold its breath. But still, the world turned above, and somewhere far off, wind whispered through dry trees. One day, if day could be the word, the tower stirred again. It began with a low tremor, not of movement, but of attention, as though it had become aware once more, not awakened, not alarmed, but curious. And slowly, gently, something began to climb. Not a man, not a child. Something small, something quiet. Tiny nails scratching faintly against the inner walls. The stone welcomed it, knew it. Like a mother recognizing the steps of a child long gone. And when it emerged into the first hollow room above the cellar, its eyes were wide with wonder. A cat, thin, bone-tight, amber-eyed, but not afraid. It padded softly through the dust, tail swishing once, then still. It sniffed the old journal, still resting on the hollow floor. It blinked at the dry ink. And then, without hesitation, it sat, exactly in the circle of silence where the man had once slept, and blinked, once, twice. And on the far wall, beneath the once cracked wooden hatch, a tiny moth stirred. Its wings shimmered gray-blue, then white, then vanished. The cat did not chase. It watched, then turned its head toward the stairwell, and looked up. The spiral stretched endlessly above, more than 80 steps, then more, then forgotten numbers. But the cat began to climb, tail swaying, body low, each paw step a whisper, each level a memory. It passed the empty rooms. The place where the man had once seen the symbol of breath, the chamber where silence had drawn spirals in the dust, the crooked window that never let the wind inside, all unchanged, yet not untouched. And then it paused. On the 7th floor, where the air had always felt thick with time, there was now a chair, not an old one, not carved, just a single wooden chair, painted white. It faced the wall, and beneath it, a small bowl, clean, empty, but placed with care. The cat stepped close, sniffed, and for a brief moment, as if in reward, a single drop of water formed inside the bowl. Perfect. Round, the cat drank it. And the walls, for the first time in centuries, sighed, not with breath, but with something older. The kind of sound only homes make when someone comes back. The cat curled on the floor beside the chair and slept. And upstairs, all the way to the top of the tower, the dust began to shift again. New footprints, new shapes, not human, but still sacred. The listening had resumed, and somewhere, deep within the walls, a voice spoke, so faint it might not have been heard at all. He left the door open. Not an accusation, not surprise, just relief. Because now others could find it again. Those who needed the silence, those who carried too much. The tower had room for them all. It had always been waiting, patient, quiet. And now it listened again, not only for secrets, but for returning. The cat did not stay long. It rose before the hour could shift, blinking away the dreamless dust of sleep as if it had only come to check something, to make sure the silence was still safe. And when it disappeared back down the spiral stairs, its tail the last thing to vanish from the white chair's floor, the tower felt no sadness, only readiness. It would be needed again soon. And not long after, footsteps arrived, real ones this time, echoing, measured, boots, leather. A rhythm that had not touched the old stones in generations, but the tower did not flinch. A figure stepped in through the ancient arched entrance, hood drawn low, a lamp flickering in one gloved hand. The figure looked around, not with wonder, not with fear, but with a familiarity that unnerved the dusk. She had been here before, in stories, in blood, and in the sound she never forgot. The hush that wasn't just absence of noise, but something more sentient. A silence that waited back. She placed her lamp on the floor near the center of the base chamber, then opened a leather-bound book with corners stained by years of wind, rain, and something darker. Inside, sketches. Ink faded to the shade of dried rose petals, spiral diagrams, symbols of listening, a drawing of the tower itself, from above, labeled Observatory of Absence. She traced the ink with one finger, the page beneath that held a single sentence. It was in a language most had forgotten, but she had not, and neither had the tower. As she spoke the words aloud, the walls around her seemed to hum faintly, a sound so low it brushed the bottom of hearing. Nothing moved, but everything had changed. She knew where she was now. And more importantly, the tower knew who she was. She stood. The stairwell rose ahead like a gullet lined in stone and memory. Each floor would test her. She expected that. The script had warned her. But what she carried inside her coat, wrapped tightly in black linen, was not something she could lose. She took the first step, then the second. Her hand brushed the inner wall for balance, and the stone was warm, not warm from sun, warm from remembering. By the time she reached the second floor, the air had changed again. It felt thicker here, more alert, like breathing in water. On the floor, a ring of small stones arranged in a perfect oval. She stepped around them carefully, not breaking the circle, because that would mean starting over. And she did not have time, not warm from sun. And then, without hesitation, it sat, exactly in the circle of silence where the man had once slept and blinked. Once, twice. And on the far wall, beneath the once cracked wooden hatch, a tiny moth stirred. Its wings shimmered gray-blue, then white, then vanished. The cat did not chase. It watched, then turned its head toward the stairwell, and looked up. The spiral stretched endlessly above, more than 80 steps, then more, then forgotten numbers. But the cat began to climb, tail swaying, body low, each paw step a whisper, each level a memory. It passed the empty rooms, the place where the man had once seen the symbol of breath, the chamber where silence had drawn spirals in the dust, the crooked window that never let the wind inside, all unchanged, yet not untouched. And then it paused. On the 7th floor, where the air had always felt thick with time, there was now a chair, not an old one, not carved, just a single wooden chair painted white. It faced the wall, and beneath it, a small bowl, clean, empty, but placed with care. The cat stepped close, sniffed, and for a brief moment, as if in reward, a single drop of water formed inside the bowl. Perfect. Round. The cat drank it, and the walls, for the first time in centuries, sighed, not with breath, but with something older. The kind of sound only homes make when someone comes back. The cat curled on the floor beside the chair and slept. And upstairs, all the way to the top of the tower, the dust began to shift again. New footprints, new shapes, not human, but still sacred. The listening had resumed, and somewhere deep within the walls a voice spoke, so faint it might not have been heard at all. He left the door open. Not an accusation, not surprise, just relief. Because now others could find it again. those who needed the silence, those who carried too much. The tower had room for them all. It had always been waiting, patient, quiet. And now it listened again, not only for secrets, but for returning. The cat did not stay long. It rose before the hour could shift, blinking away the dreamless dust of sleep, as if it had only come to check something, to make sure the silence was still safe. And when it disappeared back down the spiral stairs, its tail the last thing to vanish from the white chair's floor, the tower felt no sadness, only readiness. It would be needed again soon. And not long after, footsteps arrived. Real ones this time. Echoing. Measured. Boots. Leather. A rhythm that had not touched the old stones in generations, but the tower did not flinch. A figure stepped in through the ancient arched entrance, hood drawn low, a lamp flickering in one gloved hand. The figure looked around, not with wonder, not with fear, but with a familiarity that unnerved the dusk. She had been here before, in stories, in blood, and in the sound she never forgot. The hush that wasn't just absence of noise, but something more sentient. A silence that waited back. She placed her lamp on the floor near the center of the base chamber, then opened a leather-bound book with corners stained by years of wind, rain, and something darker. Inside, sketches. Ink faded to the shade of dried rose petals, spiral diagrams, symbols of listening, a drawing of the tower itself. From above. Labeled, Observatory of Absence. She traced the ink with one finger, the page beneath that held a single sentence. It was in a language most had forgotten, but she had not, and neither had the tower. As she spoke the words aloud, the walls around her seemed to hum faintly. A sound so low it brushed the bottom of hearing. Nothing moved, but everything had changed. She knew where she was now. And more importantly, the tower knew who she was. She stood. The stairwell rose ahead like a gullet lined in stone and memory. Each floor would test her. She expected that. The script had warned her. But what she carried inside her coat, wrapped tightly in black linen, was not something she could lose. She took the first step, then the second. Her hand brushed the inner wall for balance, and the stone was warm. Not warm from sun, warm from remembering. By the time she reached the second floor, the air had changed again. It felt thicker here, more alert, like breathing in water. On the floor, a ring of small stones arranged in a perfect oval. She stepped around them carefully, not breaking the circle, because that would mean starting over. And she did not have time, not warm from sun. On the fourth floor, the walls whispered names, not loudly, not clearly, but names she recognized from her grandfather's old journal. Names that had never been spoken out loud, only drawn in ink, with ears and mouths shaped in shadow. She smiled softly, whispered one name back. The whispers stopped, satisfied, and on the fifth floor, the doorway narrowed, deliberately, as if only allowing her through if she was willing to bow her head and acknowledge something greater than herself. She did. And as she passed beneath the arch, she remembered the final line of the old book. If you do not come with silence in your heart, the tower will keep you talking to your own echo until your bones rot. The tower had no use for noise. It only opened for those who could carry silence like an offering. When she reached the seventh floor, she saw it. The chair, the bowl, the faint paw prints in the dust. She didn't speak. She only knelt beside the bowl. Poured a few drops of water from a flask wrapped in dark velvet. The water sat still in the stone curve and then rippled once, twice, then stopped. She waited. A breath. A pause. Then she rose and continued climbing. Each floor now came faster. The tower had recognized her completely. She was not the man who had come seeking silence. She was not the child who listened to echoes. She was not the moth, nor the cat, nor the stones. She was the one who returned with something. And the tower, for the first time, prepared to answer back. The final stairs did not creak. They didn't even sigh. Stone, aged by centuries, should groan under weight. But these last few steps seemed lighter than thought. Each one lifted her higher, yet demanded nothing in return. And when she reached the top, there was no grand threshold, no ritual doorway. Just an opening. A circular mouth in the ceiling, like the tower had grown tired of pretending to be a place, and decided to be a being instead. She stepped through, and entered the room that had no name. It wasn't what she expected. There were no great mechanisms, no glowing altars, no diagrams burned into the floor. There was only space, and in the center, a pedestal. Upon it, a single strand of what looked like hair, suspended mid-air above the stone. It wasn't floating. It was being held by nothing visible, just there, waiting. She approached slowly. The strand of hair was black, long, curved at the end as though it had once curled behind an ear now long gone to soil. It vibrated slightly as she neared. She stopped, unwrapped the object from her coat. Black linen. 3 folds, each one older than the last. Inside, a shard, not glass, not crystal. It shimmered like oil on paper, shifting colors as if remembering rain that never fell. She placed the shard gently beside the pedestal. It didn't react, but the room did. The silence thickened, dense as fog, like breathing in velvet. She closed her eyes and sat cross-legged, hands on her knees, heart steady. Then she did the one thing most who visited the tower had never dared. She spoke, just one sentence. "I've come to give your silence a name." At first, nothing. Then, the strand of hair twitched, once, then again. She opened her eyes. The strand began to descend toward the shard, like it recognized it, like it had been waiting for it. When the hair brushed the shard, neither vanished. Instead, a sound emerged. No, not a sound, a tone. Low, not music, not language, something between memory and weather. It filled the room slowly, like smoke that refused to burn. She did not flinch, because she had read the story. And more than that, she had lived what came after it. The day her grandmother lost her voice. The day her mother forgot her own name for a full hour. The night she herself had heard whispers beneath her pillow when no one else was home. They were all fragments, all pieces, all echoes of this tower, of the moment when the silence stopped observing and started remembering. The tone rose higher, and then it split, not into chaos, but into words. Soft, rounded, ancient. She didn't understand them all, but one word repeated, over and over. Alicora. The tower was speaking, not in language, in identity. It was giving its name, not the label it had been given by architects or scribes, not the symbol etched on old city maps, its true name. The sound it knew itself by, carved into stone by silence itself. Alicora. She whispered it back. The room pulsed, and she understood. This was not a tower that watched over emptiness. This was a memory bank for the parts of the world that had been erased. Forgotten stories, swallowed names, buried truths. Every silence that once screamed and was then silenced was stored here, not as noise, but as vibration. She had not come here to awaken it. She had come here to join it. The shard and the hair strand fused now, melting into a perfect, suspended tear. She reached out, touched it, and just like that, she was no longer sitting in the room. She was inside the memory. A sea. A ship. Stars overhead that did not exist on any modern map. A song hummed by a girl no older than 10, humming as the boat rocked and the men rowed in silence. The song wasn't in any known language, but the tower had kept it. She saw herself not as a visitor, but as a carrier, a vessel to bring lost voices into places that had forgotten how to listen. The moment snapped. She was back in the room. The tear still floated, but now her eyes were wet too. The silence didn't end. It simply bowed its head. It had accepted her. And when she finally stood and turned to descend, the tower sighed, not out of sorrow, but relief. She had come not to break the quiet, but to give it meaning again. When she stepped down from the top chamber, she expected the silence to fade, to return to the kind she had always known. The everyday hush of stone and wind, the absence of noise. But it didn't. The silence had changed. It followed her, but not as an echo, more like a second skin. It had memory now. It had weight. Every stair she descended no longer groaned or cracked, not out of strength, but out of respect. As if the tower itself knew that something had shifted, as if the very bones of the place had realigned. When she reached the chamber with the shattered tablet, the floor was no longer cold, and the hairline fracture had sealed. The crack was gone. In its place, a single shallow inscription, just one word, Alakora. She knelt and brushed her fingers across it. It was smooth, freshly carved by no human hand. The silence had written it, not with tools, but with presence. It had found a way to sign its name. She stood, felt the tower humming beneath her boots. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A low, living vibration like the breath of something ancient finally exhaled. The lanterns on the walls flickered in rhythm, not with wind, but with the pulse of the place. She moved through the levels quietly, but no longer cautiously, not as a stranger, not as a trespasser. She was witness now. When she passed the staircase where she had once lost her footing, the dust had been swept. The web that had stretched across the top banister, gone. It was as if the tower was tidying itself, preparing. She reached the floor with the mirrors, the ones that had once twisted her reflection into people she'd never seen. Now, each mirror showed only one thing, her, exactly as she was. No distortion, no trick, just truth. She stepped forward, in one mirror, her own face. But beside it, for the briefest moment, the outline of a woman she'd never met. Tall, draped in fabric too old to name, eyes closed, hands folded in peace. Then she was gone, not vanished, just returned. Returned to the silence that now held everything. She exhaled and kept walking. At the base of the spiral staircase, the brass door was open. Sunlight streamed in. The tower had no need to hold her anymore. She paused, turned back once. The stones glowed faintly in the light, no longer cold, no longer watching, just waiting. But not for her, for others. For the next soul who would come searching, not for answers, but for the echo of a voice they couldn't name. She stepped into the daylight. The forest was silent. Not empty, just still. The kind of stillness that exists right after the snow falls but before anyone touches it. She didn't look back again. There was no need. She carried the silence with her now. And in time, she knew she'd begin to hear other things. A woman humming on the train platform. A child tapping on a park bench in perfect rhythm with the clouds. A voice on a radio, crackling with half-forgotten stories from a town that didn't appear on any map. The silence would recognize them, and so would she. Because once you learn the name of silence, you never unhear it. You never unsee it. And most of all, you never walk alone again. Somewhere behind her, the tower stood quiet. Still, but not asleep. It was listening, as it always had, and always would.